You are listening to the Muslim Mind Collaborative podcast,
Understanding mental health services and experiences of Muslim communities in the UK.
So welcome to the Muslim Mind Collaborative podcast episode for World Suicide Prevention Day. A trigger warning to all our listeners on the topic of suicide. The theme for World Suicide Day 2022, as set by the International Association for Suicide Prevention, is creating hope through action. Through our podcast, we hope to explore the topic of suicide in faith communities and how we need to better understand the mental health and well-being needs of people, whatever their background, creed, or colour, to ensure that they're heard, cared for, and given the right support. Through hope, we want to convey to individuals suffering from despair, depression, or loneliness that there is help available. And through our collective efforts, we can help save and transform lives by creating more inclusive and adequate pathways to support for all communities. There is no single reason for why people die by suicide. Social, psychological, and cultural factors can contribute to a person being at greater risk of suicide. Here in the UK in 2020, 6,248 people took their own lives, and suicide is the number one killer of men who die under the age of 45, and the fourth leading cause of death in 15 to 29-year-olds. It's the second most common cause of death amongst homeless people in England and Wales. And with that context, I'd like to introduce our guests. We've got Maria Mahmood, who is a director at the Muslim Youth Helpline, a free, non-judgmental, faith and culturally sensitive helpline service. In their 2020 impact report, it stated that the helpline saw a 300% increase in traffic. The report found that 32% of young British Muslims have suffered with suicidal thoughts, and 52% have suffered with depression, and 63% have struggled with anxiety, and 40% of young men said that they had spoken to no one about their latest mental health issues. Louise is head of suicide prevention at Rethink Mental Illness, working on a pioneering suicide prevention program in partnership with North West London Integrated Care System. The innovative program is a social response to the suicide prevention and puts communities and experts by experience at the heart of co-producing solutions. Louise previously worked with Macmillan Cancer Support, addressing health inequalities found in Mind the CAP report through projects like a co-produced community campaigning toolkit and ethnography stories included in the GP guideline for good practice. Whilst at St. Joseph's Hospice, she set up the first volunteer-led project for people with dementia and provided masterclasses to other professionals. She also set up and managed the award-winning Islington Bereavement Service, which won National Council Palliative Care's Bereavement Project of the Year in 2017, and has presented at the Westminster Briefing Conference in 2016 on her work. And Louise is passionate about making communities more resilient and tackling health inequalities. Finally, our third guest is Safia Khan, a trainee cognitive behavioral therapist working at Spirited Minds, a mental health Muslim organization trying to break the barriers of accessing mental health, who offer therapy, workshops, research, and Muslim mental health content. So thank you for joining us for this episode. If I can start by asking what we understand about suicide and suicide prevention. Louise, would you like to go first?
Thank you for inviting me here today. I think what I wanted to get across today really is about everybody having a role to play in suicide prevention and suicide awareness, and really trying to understand and be honest around some of the shame, taboos and stigma around suicide and thoughts about that, and within certain communities, and how to tackle that in the best way possible. So for me, this is such a difficult topic. You talked about statistics at the beginning, and for every one statistic, that's one person, and there's a huge ripple effect for that person, and up to 135 people affected by one death through suicide. So it has a huge impact on communities, and we really need to think about being honest in that and really equipping our communities to deal with really honest and open conversations with people, and being confident enough to say to someone, are you feeling like taking your life? Is that what you're saying to me? And really encouraging those in-depth conversations rather than shutting down a conversation and thinking, no, this is too complex, it needs to be dealt with by a clinician. It's everyone's responsibility, I think, to support others who aren't feeling great and need something. And I think if we got anything across today to the listeners, it would be that, to kind of really listen well, listen actively, and really try and pick up those feelings with people around you, because every one of us has got a role to play, and any one of us can be in contact at any time with someone who's feeling suicidal. You don't have to be in a clinical arena to have that happen to you.
Sure. And Safia?
Yeah, I think suicide is something that I'm very used to speaking about. To me, it's when we're looking at the definition. So to me, it's somebody who is feeling at kind of the end of its tether, and doesn't really see any other alternative. And so because of the level of despair they have, it then leads them to think about that being a solution. And generally speaking, it's very tunnel vision. They're not really able to see kind of what there actually is there for them left in the world because of how they're feeling. When it comes to prevention, I also agree. It comes down to, me as a professional having these conversations, making sure that actually I'm saying an appropriate response to somebody so they are able to continue to keep in touch with me and let me know how things are going. But also from being a human perspective, just caring about the people around us and making sure we're checking in. And if somebody is expressing it, yes, giving them support, but also pointing them in the right direction as well.
And Maria?
I mean, we talk about suicide prevention because suicide is preventable. I think that's the first thing we need to acknowledge. And it's preventable because it's a collection of efforts at a community level, at an individual level, at all levels really, that can reduce that risk of suicide for that individual. Number one, understanding warning signs. So that's educating yourself and people around you about those warning signs. And sometimes they're not so obvious. And sometimes one individual may make them very obvious. So it's really understanding what those clear signs are for that individual and how they're feeling. You can look at suicidal behavior that exists, and it sometimes does exist on a continuum from like thinking about ending one's life to developing that plan and then actually ending one's life. But within that continuum, there's so much you can look into. Their feelings, their thoughts, their physical appearance, their behavior, all of these changes and all disparities that suddenly come about. So that's definitely the warning signs. Sometimes what we find on the helpline is that when we look at suicide prevention, it's also the social and economic factor that we can support. So yes, you can help them with coping mechanisms, but they also may need things like they're struggling financially. Where can we signpost them to? What's the most appropriate support out there for them? And I guess for each individual, that's very, very different. So looking at their case in a very holistic way, because everyone is very unique and their story is very unique and their needs are very unique as well. But yes, once again, identifying those risks, supporting them, that is what suicide prevention is. It's reducing all of those risk factors.
Absolutely. I mean, you said something really key around, I guess, looking at each individual in a really holistic way. Often when we look at suicide, or you look at suicide prevention or kind of crisis support, you're very much at that kind of end stage of desperation in many ways, right? And there is so much to that story and so much that precedes that, that has so many layers of complexities, like you mentioned about the socioeconomic circumstances and other triggers and other kind of areas of mental distress and mental disorders, which really do kind of bring to light, I guess, the perspectives, but those areas that really do need to be understood, defined and unpacked in many ways. So it's a real complex area, whilst obviously having to deal with the kind of, I guess, the seriousness of the situation at hand at that point. If obviously this person has come to seek help at that kind of end stage. Now, before we kind of go into other areas around what is provided in terms of services and how we certainly address I guess the suicidal prevention approaches with faith communities, I wanted to explore a little bit more about faith. I mean, we all know that it's a taboo. A lot of stuff around mental health unfortunately is, but particularly suicide, I think there isn't often very much an understanding around, I guess, the importance that we should have as just human, as people, in really being able to seek help as a person, obviously in a crisis situation. I think often people do bring in faith and religion as almost another layer, which can certainly be quite distractive often of obviously what the core issues might be. And so I wanted to kind of explore that. And so Safia and Maria, what are your kind of observations of that when trying to obviously give support to Muslims that come to your helpline? How much of I guess faith does come up, and how much of that is really integral in not only the support that you're providing and understanding their identity, but actually, can faith act as a deterrent to suicidal ideation?
I would definitely say it can. Having worked so I work in a very multicultural area where I do see a lot of Muslims as well as people from other faith, and generally across the board, when there is faith involved, there definitely is normally more resilience, because you have that belief of there being a kind of the hereafter after we pass, and actually what that potentially could look like if things go well in this world. It kind of gives you that kind of hope that actually, okay, although my life here might be rubbish, if I keep going, one, it might improve, because as we know in Islam, we say that when things get harder, they follow. When with goodness, normally things are kind of eases your pain. And so that is something that I kind of use quite often. I think also, although there is an element of being a Muslim, it's also important to be aware of how religious they actually are. And because my name being quite obviously a Muslim person's name, when somebody calls up, they almost have a bit of an assumption that there's gonna be some judgment basically around their faith if they're doing things that aren't potentially within what is Islamically guided to do or not do, like for example drink as a way of coping and other things like that. So it's also one, normalizing that these thoughts are completely normal, everyone has them, and actually they don't weaken your faith. And actually one of the solutions isn't to just go pray, which is commonly used when people do go to their family members. Actually, they're very common, a lot more common than people realize. I think I read some of the statistics. I think it was like 40% of people said they've had suicidal thoughts at some point. It is very important, but it depends on how religious the person is. And for example, when it comes to things like safety planning, I might use elements of praying, listening to the Quran, those kinds of things as kind of like a form of containment, and also using kind of family and just being able to speak, not necessarily about how they're feeling, but that distraction of being around family also being helpful.
Sure. And what about the Muslim Youth Helpline, Maria?
So, I mean, each experience of suicide is as unique as the callers come in. But generally speaking, what we find on the helpline is that those who experience suicidal thoughts are higher in callers with other mental health concerns. So they usually do talk about depression and anxiety, for instance. So I guess for your question, I would say it really does depend on that individual's relationship with faith, and where they are, and also their mental health concerns and how much that plays with their view on themselves, their relationship with God, their faith, all of this. I don't think it's as clear cut or as simple as like having faith and then therefore you would not have either strong suicidal thoughts, or it would deter you from maybe taking one's life. I remember I was reading, I've actually got it written here somewhere, but there was a study that I came across by Prague, and it's 2009, I think, and it said that study that showed that the religiosity experienced as a source of, if religiosity is experienced as a source of hope and confidence, it reduces the risk of depression in times of like mounting stress, and actually facilitates the recovery and diminishes suicidal risk. But if the religiosity experience is a source of guilt and fear, it actually has the opposite effect. So we get a whole plethora of young people coming in, and how they manage their mental health, or the discussions around suicide, and how they slot in faith and religion can really determine how they feel about themselves, or the chances of them taking their life or not. A lot of conversations around forgiveness, and the utilizing the term forgiveness. Will God forgive me? Can I forgive myself? All of these things come up, and depending on how they see themselves in this world and in relation to God and any higher being, really does determine that. So I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. It really does depend on where that individual sees themselves, and also at what point of their journey they're on as well. Some people call us when they are at real crisis moment, and they do discuss suicide as the only way, because they've actually gone through all of the entire realization, and they've had their discussions about God, or they've had their discussions around anything that could support them or be comforting. But we also get a lot of calls where we have suicide being discussed, taking one's life being discussed, and then they'll say, oh, but I'll never do it because of my faith. And that would always be the last point that they'll make. But, oh, I would never do it because I am struggling right now, and I've definitely self-harmed, or I always think about it, but I would never do it because of my faith. So, you have some individuals where it definitely is a deterrent.
It's really fascinating, actually, kind of really hearing what some of those stories are, and how that certainly has come into play in the way that people are processing this, and really, how it can deter, how it can actually be something that, like you said, drives that guilt even forward, and certainly does exacerbate some of those issues. And Lourdes, if I could perhaps ask, perhaps even with the way other faith communities, look to, I guess, their faith, spirituality, their kind of religion, as a protective characteristic in the mental health support that they seek. What are your observations and understanding of that?
I mean, what we found that actually people will go and seek support where they would naturally meet in groups. So if it's a place of worship, that they would have their social friends and social connections there, that is probably where they'd go for support. And often, sometimes it's the sort of traditional counselling maybe feels a bit more alien, and it's not often the first port of call for a support system. And that's why for our programme, for example, we're looking at community groups and organisations finding really tailored solutions that are right for them and their particular communities. So we've done a listening event with the Jewish community, for example, and lots of people spoke openly there about some of their experiences. And yeah, it's just thinking about that kind of natural network. And I know I mentioned the Delicate Mind, which was set up to serve the Muslim community. And Nick, who speaks there, felt that traditional services weren't right for him, and that's why he set up that project. So it has that spiritual element that is right. And yeah, so it's just that sense of not everything is right for everybody. Sometimes it's different approaches that are needed.
Sure. Now, talking about approaches, and a lot of what we're trying to do through the Muslim Mind Collaborative, and I think our kind of broader work and vision is around creating faith and culture competency, and how services can better address the needs of Muslim communities. And Lourdes, you already mentioned the Delicate Mind program. It'd be interesting to hear more about how Rethink Mental Illness, explores faith and cultural diversity and sensitivities in the support services that you provide, and perhaps examples of best practice models from your organisation.
Yeah, I think we've really tried to encourage different groups to apply for funding. So we had one group that's still they haven't applied yet, but they were looking at using some of our suicide awareness training and tailoring that to a more Islamic approach. And we've got the traveller movement, for example, as well. There, men are 6 times more likely to take their lives than men in other communities, and they are working with our training too and trying to tailor that to their communities. So we've got a walk and talk group for men. We've got a comedy course that some men are going to be working on to set up. We've got a writing group for women who are survivors of abuse and domestic violence. So it's lots of different approaches and different ways of working. Yeah.
Sure. And then if we have other services and organizations listening to this episode that work closely within the Muslim community or are thinking of kind of, I guess, innovation in their spaces and partnership opportunities, what are some of those routes in really and opportunities to reach out and perhaps, collaborate or be a part of informing and shaping some of your services and organizations that rethink mental illness, so that there is that recognition of, Muslim mental health, but also, the representation and engagement and inclusivity of these sorts of communities. What kind of advice and support could you give them for those that may want to reach out or may want to perhaps be a part of shaping and informing some of these services?
Our programme is in North West London, so 8 boroughs within North West London. I'd encourage them to just get in touch with me. I can share my details later. And we're hoping to have another round of funding available from autumn time, and that will so organisations just can apply for grants to do some co-production work or innovation and discuss that with me and my team and come up with some ideas together perhaps as well.
Thank you. And Safia and Mario, obviously you both work in youth helpline services, working closely in the Muslim community. So when we talk about best practice models and we talk about faith and culture competency, I mean, it's all integrated and part of the service that you provide, but it'd be really great to hear from your perspective of, what that really looks like, again, for other mainstream services and other services that do also work with Muslim communities, but don't necessarily have that bespoke specialist kind of support. How does that kind of convey through your services and the approaches that you take, and how important and integral is that in obviously providing that support to the communities that you serve?
I'd say looking at the individual in a very their approach, taking the approach that's a very holistic approach for them, and understanding it may not be the lens that you're looking at your life, but actually they may have additional pressures and guilt associated with suicide, and a lot of the people, especially those that come from racialized backgrounds and Muslim backgrounds, tend to come from collectivist cultures, and so the ripple effect that they taking their life could have. And it's probably a thought process that maybe not a lot of people would go through, but the guilt is quite intense. And so when they utilize helplines, unlike going to your GP, and so when we do signpost some people to the GP, they're like, no way would I go to my GP, because as soon as you go to your GP, it's written on your record. And this is a topic that they don't even want to let people know that they're thinking about. The idea of a helpline is that they can call and they can be completely anonymous, and it's not written down anywhere. There is no paper trail of their darkest, deepest secrets or thoughts that they sometimes haven't, before the helpline, haven't even said to themselves really, or said out loud or acknowledged it. And so when you are dealing, a lot of counselors or other support services, when you are dealing with young people and young Muslims, it's to allow them to talk in the language that they're most comfortable, and that not necessarily the actual language, but the terminology that they use. Let them reference things like relationships with God and their religion, their household, makeup, their relationships with their family, things like that, things that are maybe quite alien to you, or concepts that you might not understand. Allow them to speak in those terms, and give them that space. And also it's very important that when young people and young Muslims are speaking, that they don't feel like they have to make the other person feel comfortable. So when you're really low and you're turning to a helpline, or you're turning to a counsellor, you just want to be able to speak your mind, and you don't want to sit there and think, well, I need to now explain all these terms to this individual, or actually the terminology that I'm using is actually making this person feel very uncomfortable. So allow them to feel comfortable and speak their mind and speak about what's going on. Another thing that we find on the helpline is that mental health a lot across religious groups is number one, very it's not researched as well. And so we know mental health across cultural groups, but we don't know much about mental health across religious groups. And so there's a lot more to know about young Muslims and mental health, and young Sikh females and mental health, and across religious groups. And so tap into other faith groups when you want to know and when you want to learn. Mainstream support services engage with other groups. Sometimes they are the first stop for a lot of young people. Reach out to them, understand what are their top primary concerns, what are some of the trends that they're seeing on their helplines, what are some of the coping mechanisms that they find best work for the people that they serve. Never assume that mental health and coping mechanisms are the same across the board. That's another one that I would say. And also, I guess it's just the fact that religious concerns are still very concerning for young people to vocalize, and especially young Muslims. They do find that they are constantly being looked at in a particular way, and so they don't want to come across as having additional trouble, and that mental health concern can be in anything additional to what's happening in their lives. There is a lot of paranoia in regards to how your teachers or the doctors or anyone else that you're interacting with may look at you in a particular way. And if you have mental health concerns, that can definitely be heightened in a situation like this. So always creating that safe space and acknowledging that everyone's relationships with people in authority are very, very different. And so putting people at ease when it comes to, you as someone in authority having a relationship with a young minor, and really understanding those dynamics and making them as safe as possible.
Absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly important that, I guess, taking those approaches convey that kind of comfort and create those safe spaces. Safia, what about the kind of services that are provided at Inspirited Minds? I mean, how does, if perhaps you could share some of those scenarios and case studies with us in terms of, the access that some of the young people have through your services?
Yeah, so we offer counselling for anyone over the age of 18, as long as they live in the UK. We have all Muslim counsellors and therapists intentionally with different levels of training. So there are some courses out there like Islamic counselling and Islamic psychotherapy, which just kind of allows you to intertwine your faith and your faith within the therapeutic intervention, and almost becoming a better Muslim at the end of the treatment almost in itself. And I think as a therapist, you also learn so much more about your faith beyond the kind of the bog standard stuff that we're kind of taught as children, essentially. I think the kind of things that I would also suggest would be helpful is, when you are safety planning, do incorporate faith if a person has expressed faith, if that makes sense. So I think that's one thing that hits home. If you make a safety plan and you incorporate a person's faith as something, as being something they see as a protective factor, if it's something that keeps them safe, utilize it when you are safety planning with people. And also just empathizing and normalizing with them that it is okay for them to feel this way. I can give you an example of a lady I assessed a couple of months ago, very distressed on the phone, first time ever accessing therapy. and she was just very guilty almost for having these thoughts in the first place. There was a lot of emotions, a lot of tearfulness, and a lot of apologizing for crying on the phone. And actually, I always say to anyone crying on the phone whenever I do an assessment that actually this is your space, this is your time. If you want to cry, that's totally fine. And actually, you know, crying can be really helpful. And with this lady in particular, there was a lot of other complexities, a lot of childhood abuse, other things kind of going on for her and being triggered, and how I kind of applauded her about how she managed to contain it and cope with it without getting support for so long. Just because some of the symptoms she was experiencing were so severe, she had done amazingly well to get to this point. So I think also acknowledging the hard work and the daily effort that it takes to be able to deal with these thoughts. I think for anybody who's not experienced them before and then getting them for the first time, for example, it kind of gives you a realization of the depth of these thoughts that a person can really go through. In terms of other guidance, I would say is also just get interested in people's faith. For example, like this is more, I guess, if you're doing treatment than assessing anyone with suicidality. But if you've got somebody who is a Muslim or who is Jewish or Hindu or a Sikh, just looking into their faith and learning a bit more about it, because a lot of the times I think the issue that comes to hand is you have to do a lot of explaining. Oh, this is what God is, this is what my faith is, this is what fasting is, like all of these things, this is what the funeral process is like, and just learning more about that. I think the other thing at Inspirited Minds that we do is we do a lot of online workshops, just educating the public about mental health from an Islamic perspective in different areas. So if you're interested, come along, listen to a workshop, have a look at the content. We have loads of articles online about looking at things from a Muslim perspective. I had a quick look on our website before coming here. There's at least 4 or 5 articles around suicide and like the things that potentially could be said to somebody to kind of help them cope with it. So even, you know, the general public here, if you're not sure you've got a son or a daughter who's having those kinds of thoughts, have a look on the website. There's a lot of really good content on there that you can take away and use.
Sure, and Inspirited Minds also has a podcast, which is incredible.
Yes.
You know, to kind of really explore various different mental health disorders and the experiences that we see in Muslim communities, which is, you know, really important. And you know, your point around creating that relatability and connectivity, it helps ease that communication and allow people, you know, to really kind of come through, which is really important in creating that environment for people to feel secure and trusted and at ease. If I can ask the three of you, really, if there are any examples of collective actions and kind of partnership opportunities that have improved service outcome.
Are you talking about collaboration with any sorts of different organisations, or particularly?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I guess the concept of collaboration and partnership and those sorts of opportunities, how they can really help build out with some of the kind of desired kind of outcomes and improving the services that you provide, obviously, by being able to utilize other resources, experience and expertise. I know that you touched on it on some of your previous projects, but you know, wanted to open that question up really to all three of you again around you know, collective action, really.
I think for me, what is particularly exciting is when traditional sort of services would marry up with services like Maria's and Safia's. You know, there you've got your particular niche expertise, your skill set, you know what you need to provide, and then that can be partnered with you know, traditional services that are already offered, and seeing where you can get strengths from that, and maybe scaling up what you do as well. Because I think often the organisations like your organisations are providing the solutions that traditional services cannot and will never, and don't know how to, basically. So it's that marrying up of those skill sets and being able to almost produce a model that's available in other areas as well. So I think that's where the strengths are, and from traditional services recognising where that niche kind of tailored approach is really, really needed. For example, just the recovery college, we're working with 2 recovery colleges in Northwest London, And we're also working with some comedians there, and some men from the local area. So what we're hoping is we're getting, often if you get really interesting collaborations like artists involved or comedians or people who are offering something really niche, I think that's where the really interesting sort of co-production can happen, and you're able to scale up the work that you're doing.
Sure. I mean, Safi and Maria, there may be other kind of creative avenues that your organizations have taken in looking at other solutions, but also, perhaps if we can bring in also, the referral pathways and kind of signposting to service when we look at kind of collective actions and look at ways in which you've been able to improve the service outcomes, the impact, and the way that you've been able to reach out to, marginalized communities and those from the Muslim community.
I think from an experience in my perspective, we've worked really closely with the mosques. We actually, I believe we run some training programs around religious leaders, normalizing those conversations, making it more common. We also do a number of outreach events throughout the whole country, just bringing more awareness and kind of, again, having those normalizing conversations with people about mental health does exist. It's not a bad thing if you do struggle with your mental health. I think, in the South Asian Muslim community, we're very good at dealing with diabetes and cancer and all of these other things, but actually the focus also being around mental health being a common thing and something to be comfortable with. So I think that's one thing that we've tried really hard to do. We've also kind of partnered up with the NHS, offering therapy to NHS Muslims who worked for the NHS, basically, so staff members, through the pandemic, and had a really good turnout and really good feedback from that. And we're looking to do some more of those partnerships going forward, inshallah. And I think what's the other thing I was going to mention? The other thing I was going to mention is there is whenever every year the lovely NHS bring out a good practice guide, which is specifically put towards marginalized societies, and there's always some really lovely stuff in there around the BAME community, and unfortunately not all of it gets put into practice. So that's also another thing that you can, as a service, if you're looking to kind of improve and kind of get that greater accent, have a look at the good practice guide and have a look at what adaptations you can make to your sessions, your access, reaching out to communities and stuff like that, to be able to get more people through the door and support them in the right way as well.
Thank you. And Maria?
I'd say our best partnerships and collaborations are always the ones that look and work at access to mental health services, but also look at supporting and educating services around what it means to be young Muslim and have a mental health. So any kind of mainstream support services that need those support services. One that sticks out is Student Minds. Now, Student Minds is the mental health organisation for all further and higher education institutions across the UK. We are the chosen Muslim charity for that, which means that for any college or university students, they push out our services to them. They push out all types of services, but for young Muslims, they push out our services, and it just means that they are aware when they need to talk to anyone that we are available, we're free, and they have a list of organizations that they push out, not just based on faith, but for instance, they'll have ones based on just OCD. So for instance, OCD Action, like someone who is suffering with OCD needs support, it's there. It's so that university students don't feel so isolated, and this was created during lockdown, and it has continued to, because the need was there. Another collaboration is MYHR working with Young Minds, and we're looking at how to create the best type of content for Muslims, and understanding that not generic content will work for everyone. So acknowledging that and pooling resources together to make sure that we're getting the right content out there that resonates with young people and your target audience is very, very important. Another project is looking at specific projects for a particular demographic. So not just young Muslims, but within young Muslims, what are we talking about? One of the projects we're working on is with the tampon tax project. and it is looking at young women in abusive relationships. And so it's a UK-wide project, but we're giving that Muslim lens and really shaping content for young females. One of our biggest primary concerns that comes onto the helpline are around family and relationships, and it's a huge concern that's spoken about, and it's dealing with how young people and their best friends support each other when it comes to domestic violence in relationships. So yeah, another very, very important topic.
Absolutely. I mean, it's phenomenal just, how many areas that you've certainly been able to kind of create all of these integrations, but also look at, creative ways and innovation to certainly support some of those, some of those areas to drive change and certainly to provide that specialist support. We've only got a couple of minutes left of the podcast, and as much as I'd love to be able to, talk more about some of these other projects and case studies, let's talk about suicide and bereavement. I know we don't often get to that side of stuff, but how can we look to support families and think about community intervention as well, and those that are suffering from the loss and trauma of losing somebody to suicide? I mean, what about having a look at the family unit and the communities? If I can ask Ludus, if I could ask you again, because of course I know you've got a lot of experience in this area and bereavement support, etc. What has that been like for you, and providing I guess support provisions in this area?
I think, as we said before, that we know, like with on death certificates, for example, it's often not written. If it was a suicide on there, the family maybe don't want that written down, and there's a lot of taboos around the subject, so accessing support is also difficult as well. Like I said at the beginning, up to 135 people can be affected by one person taking their life, and it's about accessing the right bereavement support. And what we found with the groups we've spoken to is actually they're finding it really difficult to know where to get support from. They have to really trail the internet, and not everyone's got access to that or can do that when they're really grieving and stressed. Yeah, it is. We've found anecdotally that people are telling us they're finding it difficult to access the right bereavement support at the right time, and that is around stigma, I think, and also police reporting and the way that's done and the delay in that sometimes.
Thank you. Safia, Maria?
Yeah, a lot of what's been said already, but definitely talk about it more. One thing I'd say is to study Muslim mental health more, put in the effort to understand what's happening so that we can diagnose, support appropriately. There's not a lot of research out there that looks at this. Teach well-being techniques to everyone, and discuss some simple things like burnout at school or work or wherever that looks like, but discuss those things and what does burnout look like, and be more compassionate to people's well-being, I'd say. And other things like check in with your friends more, and collectively get rid of this taboo around the conversations around suicide, whether you've lost someone or you yourself have suicidal thoughts.
I think for me, I've actually had like a personal experience of, well, an ex-patient of mine actually took their own life post engagement with me, and that still affects me to this day. So it's also normalizing the grief process, that actually you are going to go through waves. There are going to be sadness, anger, upset, and a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions that come with this, especially when it's kind of out of the blue. So actually really just getting comfortable with whatever you're feeling, being okay with how you're feeling, and just kind of accepting that you need the time to kind of recharge, pick yourself up together. And I think specifically from the Muslim community, not avoiding that person just because their family members committed suicide or stuff like that, or having really uncomfortable conversations with somebody around it, just being there, listening to them, hearing stories, and praying for the person, and just kind of being there as a being rather than, oh, what happened? How did it happen? Did you know? All of these kind of questions that can be really sensitive and quite I know we like to be nosy sometimes, but actually putting those boundaries in place and just being there to listen to somebody.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for your time on this podcast. It's been incredible listening to the services that you're providing, and your insights and experiences into this area that goes obviously beyond, of course, the crisis point and suicide and some of the more dire situations. But I think one of the things that I'm hearing is that the real need to understand and Muslim mental health and to be able to engage with those services, and certain examples that you have shared with us today of projects that have come through, opportunities of partnership and collaboration, a real opportunity to be able to drive change and to be able to have Muslim voices heard, and the community very much at the center of informing and shaping some of these services, which is incredibly important in how we look at not just solutions and innovation, but actually how we look at ways in which we can support the well-being of all communities. So thank you all very much for your time today.
You have been listening to the Muslim Mind Collaborative podcast. For more information, please visit bcbn.org.uk.